I want to say up front that I'm not the kind of person who makes videos like this. I've watched them, plenty of them. Guys walking through abandoned hospitals at 3 in the morning, narrating in whispers, every creak treated like evidence of something. I find them mostly embarrassing. I'm 38 years old. I drive a Kenworth T680 between Wichita and Denver, hauling refrigerated freight. I've been doing it for 11 years. I've slept in truck stops in 12 states, eaten bad food and worse life, and spent more nights alone than most people would be comfortable with. I don't rattle easily. I don't tell myself stories about the dark. So I want you to understand what it means when I tell you I uploaded that footage. And I want you to understand what it means when I tell you that before I uploaded it, before I did anything, I sat in a Denny's in Salina for almost 2 hours trying to find the version of events where I'd made a mistake, where I'd misread something, where the explanation was simple and I'd just missed it. I couldn't find that version, so I uploaded it. The Waverly Feed Mill sits about 4 miles east of Salina, Kansas, off a county road that doesn't get much traffic since the grain elevator operation in Hennessy pulled the regional business north. It closed in 2009, structural issue with the primary auger system, 2 workers injured, neither fatally. The family that owned it couldn't make the repair economics work. The land didn't sell, the silos just stood there. The way things stand when nobody's decided what to do with them yet, and the years start piling up quietly. I'd noticed it twice before on the Salina run. Big cylindrical silhouette against a flat Kansas sky, paint weathered to a color between rust and gray, the kind of structure that photographs well in late afternoon light. I have a folder on my phone, maybe 300 images over 5 years, roadside industrial decay, mills, grain elevators, water towers, one collapsed rail depot in Colorado that I spent an entire rest break documenting. I don't post most of it anywhere. It's just something I do during the mandatory 10-hour windows when I'm not legally allowed to drive. On a Tuesday night in late September, I pulled off the county road around 11 p.m., parked far enough back to be off the shoulder, and went to sleep with the windows cracked and the radio playing low. I woke up at 2:17. The sound was a deep metallic resonance, not a bang, more like a vibration, like you'd hear if you struck a large hollow cylinder and let the tone develop on its own, a long descending note through metal. Then silence. I lay there for about 40 seconds. Wind, I thought. Old metal structures flex and contract at night, especially after warm days. Thermal cycling. I'd heard similar from water towers. The sound was loud, but that didn't necessarily mean it was strange. I closed my eyes. Then it came again. Same tone, same duration, same point in the descent where it tapered off. I'm a practical man. I notice patterns because long-haul driving requires it. You read road behavior, vehicle behavior, weather behavior, all of it constantly and without thinking about it. What I was hearing had a pattern. Not the random ticking of thermal expansion, not the irregular moan of wind pressure. This was measured in a way that wind isn't. I sat up, grabbed my phone. The mill was maybe 200 yards out. I could see the silo shapes as darker columns against a dark sky, a slight difference in darkness that told me where they were. It happened a third time. I got out of the truck. I filmed for about 18 minutes from outside the perimeter fence. Most of it isn't interesting. Me pointing my phone at cylindrical shapes in the dark, the auto exposure struggling, audio picking up my own breathing and the occasional sound of the county road in the distance. At the 12-minute mark, the largest silo, leftmost of the 4, maybe 60 feet tall, did something I've watched back dozens of times since. The wall moved. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, a brief outward displacement of the metal skin, a gentle bowing like a held breath pressing against a chest from the inside. It lasted maybe 2 seconds and then settled back. If I hadn't been filming, I might have questioned whether I'd seen it at all, but the footage shows it clearly. A subtle outward bow of the silo wall and then a slight return. Something heavy had shifted against the interior surface. I stood there for a while after that. The sound didn't repeat. Whatever caused the wall to flex went still, and after about 10 minutes of silence, I walked back to the truck.
I told myself it was an animal. Large animals get into sealed structures more often than people realize. The structural integrity of a building closed for 15 years is not what it was day one. I'd read about cattle getting trapped in collapsed equipment sheds. I told myself that. I sat in the cab and thought about it with the engine idling, and by the time I pulled out on the county road, the explanation had settled into something that felt reasonable, felt finished, felt like enough. I drove out at first light. But before I left, I walked the perimeter. I'm not sure exactly why. Mild irritation at not fully closing the loop? The fence was intact. No cuts, no rust failures at the base where an animal might have pushed through. The main access gate was padlocked, an old master lock, corroded but not forced. The secondary door on the mill building itself was chained. I walked to the outside of the largest silo. The base was concrete, the lower panels of the silo wall corrugated steel bolted to a ring frame, and about 30 feet up, roughly halfway, there was a horizontal seam where two panels joined, and drifting from that seam, settled in a thin line on the concrete apron below, was grain dust. Not much of it, a fine pale drift, the kind you'd see if you ran your hand along an old bag of flour, but it was dry. The overnight dew had settled on everything. Every surface had that damp, matte look that follows a cool night in September. The grain dust was dry. It had come down after the dew settled, which meant it had come down in the last few hours. The mill had been closed for 15 years. The silos had been emptied during decommissioning. There was no stored grain. I took photographs of the dust. I drove to Salina, ate breakfast, and sat for a long time thinking about a reasonable explanation. I went through several of them. I let each one develop before I found the problem with it. By the time I got to Denver, I'd run out of reasonable explanations and started driving through the unreasonable ones, which I didn't like either. I drove the return leg without the radio on. I told myself it was because I wanted quiet. I came back 7 days later. I want to be honest about my reasoning. Truthfully, I came back because the thing I filmed bothered me in a specific way. Not a frightened way, but an unsatisfied way. I'm a person who needs things to make sense. The grain dust from an empty silo was a loose thread, and I couldn't leave it alone. I brought a better camera, a Sony that with decent low-light capability that I'd bought years ago for the abandoned building photography. I brought a flashlight. I brought nothing that suggested I thought this was going to be dangerous, because I didn't think it was going to be dangerous. I thought I was going to find evidence of squatters or a significant animal intrusion, and I thought I was going to feel satisfied and drive home. I arrived at 10 p.m., parked in the same spot, waited. At 11:40, I heard it clearly for the first time. A clicking sound. Not one click, a layered multiple source clicking, like if you took a handful of pebbles and tapped them rhythmically against a hollow drum, but from multiple directions at once. It was coming from more than one silo. Not synchronized exactly, more like call and response. One cluster of clicks, then an answering cluster from a different direction, then a third, then back to the first, then something in between. I've tried to describe it to people who've asked. The closest I can get is the sound of a large thermoplastic cooling, that intermittent creak, but made deliberate, made into something that feels like it has direction. I stood at the fence line for 6 minutes before I moved toward the access gate. The padlock was gone. Not broken, not cut, gone. The chain was still threaded through the gate handles in a way that would have kept the gate from swinging freely, but it wasn't locked, just looped, just held by its own weight. I could open it by lifting the chain off the post. I stood there for a moment. Then I looked at the primary silo door, the large access panel at ground level, built to be secured from the outside with a series of bolts. The bolts were there, all 4 of them, but they were on the wrong side. The interior bolt latches, the kind you'd slide from inside to secure a door from within, were engaged. I could see the edge of the slide bolt through the gap at the door's seam. This door was secured from the interior. I took photographs. My hands were steady. I want to be clear about that. I was not frightened at this point in the way you might expect. I was focused. The facts had a tight logic to them that I felt compelled to follow. Something was in there. something that moved, something that apparently produced or accumulated a grain supply that shouldn't exist, something that secured a large steel door from the interior of a structure that was supposed to be empty.
I found the exterior access ladder on the far side of the primary silo. Fixed steel rungs bolted to the outer wall for inspection access to the top. Old, but not failed. I tested the bottom rung. It held. I climbed. I need to mention something I didn't think about at the time, but have thought about many times since. The clicking, which had been audible the entire time I stood at the fence line and walked the gate and examined the door, it stopped when I put my foot on the first rung. Not gradually, all at once. I noticed it. I kept climbing. 60 feet is higher than it sounds when you're doing it at midnight on a ladder that hasn't been inspected in 15 years. I went slowly. The silence below me was total now. No clicking, no wind against the metal, nothing. Just the small sounds my boots made on the rungs. The inspection vent at the top was a circular hatch, maybe 20 inches across, hinged. It was not locked. I pulled it open, lay flat on the curved top of the silo, and angled the camera down into the opening. I turned on the camera light. The silo was full. Not completely. The material inside reached to within perhaps 8 feet of the vent opening, but it was full of something that looked like grain. Pale, dense, mounded. But not the flat level surface of a commercially filled silo. Not the engineered pour of agricultural storage. It was uneven, heaped. The mounds varied in height and shape, creating a landscape inside the cylinder that had its own strange topography. And across that surface, slow rippling patterns moved. Not violently, not all at once. Long diagonal waves, like the surface of still water after a stone drops, but too organized, too even, not the random scatter of small animals. The patterns moved through the grain in expanding rings and then collapsed inward again, overlapping, creating geometric interference shapes across the surface that looked almost regular, almost like something composed. I watched for approximately 40 seconds. I don't know why I spoke. Instinct, maybe. Or something less rational than instinct. When something feels like it's looking at you, there's an impulse to acknowledge it. I whispered, "What are you?" The surface of the grain rose. Not dramatically. The mounds nearest the center of the silo lifted slowly, and the ripple patterns that had been expanding outward reoriented. They stopped expanding. They began converging. Slow spiraling patterns in the grain, turning toward the center, then climbing along the cylinder wall, then climbing higher, toward me. I closed the vent. I descended the ladder faster than I should have. I got in the truck and drove to the highway. I didn't speak for a long time. I drove with the windows up and the radio off, and when I finally reached the interstate, I kept my voice down on the hands-free when my dispatcher called about the next pickup. I didn't examine why. It just felt correct to be quiet. It wasn't until I was past Salina, well onto the interstate, that I thought about my own voice, about the fact that I had been parked 200 yards from those silos the week before, talking to myself in the cab, making phone calls, playing the radio with the window cracked. They'd heard me. Whatever they were, they'd heard me, and the following night they'd made that low, resonant sound against the metal walls, and I had gotten out of the truck and walked toward them. I'd thought that was my decision. I'm less certain of that now. The footage was corrupted in the final 12 seconds. The file shows clean through my descent of the ladder, and then the last portion from when I got in the truck is unreadable. I've had the file looked at. The explanation given was a write error, probably from the camera bumping during the climb down. That's probably what it was.
I uploaded the clean portion to a regional farming forum where I sometimes post the abandoned building photography. Within 48 hours, someone had shared it to a larger platform. Within a week, 2 local news outlets had picked it up. The Kansas Department of Agriculture sent an inspection team 3 weeks after that. What they found took another 2 months to partially explain. The grain was real. Approximately 40 tons of organic material had accumulated inside the silos over an unknown period, composed of residual grain matter, decomposed plant material, and what the initial report described as significant biological material of entomological origin. An insect colony had established itself in residual grain left during decommissioning, a common enough starting point, but had persisted and grown in isolation for years, converting organic material into a composite medium that functionally resembled grain storage. The species could not be identified immediately. They were small, pale, and moved in coordinated groups. The behavioral coordination was what held up the final report for 2 additional months. An entomologist brought in to consult described, in language I'm paraphrasing from documents received through a public information request, collective behavioral patterns inconsistent with known eusocial insect models, exhibiting apparent group response to external acoustic stimuli without identified pheromonal or chemical signaling mechanism. They responded to sound, to vibration, specifically and disproportionately to human vocal frequencies. The entomologist's notes, not the official report, but personal notes included in the same information request, contained one line I've thought about more than anything else from this entire experience. He wrote, "Colony exhibits what appears to be directed response to specific frequency ranges associated with human speech. Whether this represents adaptive conditioning over the isolation period or a pre-existing behavioral trait requires further study." Adaptive conditioning. The mill had been closed for 15 years. Whatever they were, they'd been in those silos for most of that time. 15 years of isolation and darkness and the occasional sound of wind against metal. And then I'd parked 200 yards from those silos the week before, talking to myself in the cab, making phone calls, playing the radio with the window cracked. They'd heard me. Whatever they were, they'd heard me, and the following night they'd made that low, resonant sound against the metal walls, and I had gotten out of the truck and walked toward them. I'd thought that was my decision. I'm less certain of that now. They demolished the mill in February, burned the silos. The official reasoning cited structural instability and biological contamination, which isn't inaccurate as far as it goes. I drove past the site in March. Clean lot, scorched soil, a lot of very flat, empty space where 4 cylinders had been. I thought that was the end of it. In June, I picked up a load in Salina and came out of the distribution center to find 3 other drivers standing near their rigs at the edge of the lot, looking out at the adjacent wheat field. One of them I knew slightly, a guy named Peterson who runs the same corridor. "What is it?" I asked. "Something in the field," he said. "Listen." I listened. A faint sound from the wheat, just at the edge of audibility. Light, dry, rhythmic, clicking. We stood there for a while. Someone made a joke, something about cicadas. We went inside for coffee. But I noticed, walking back to the lot afterward, that none of us had spoken while we were standing there listening. Not one word. 4 grown men standing at a field edge in full daylight, and not one of us had spoken. Like we understood without discussing it that we should be quiet. Like we already knew that sound carried both ways. I've thought about that a lot. The way we all went silent at once, without any agreement, without anyone suggesting it. The way the field went silent too shortly after. The clicking stopped, and the wheat just stood there in the afternoon light, and there was nothing to see and nothing you could point to, and no particular reason to stay. I got in my truck and drove. I kept the windows up. I kept the radio off. I didn't stop for food or fuel or anything until I was well clear of Saline County, and the wheat fields were behind me, and there was nothing outside the cab but highway and dark sky, and the clean, uncomplicated sound of the road moving under the wheels. I still do that. Every time I make that run now. I keep the radio off. I don't talk to myself in the cab like I used to. I keep the windows up when I'm parked near open fields after dark. Small adjustments, most of them. Things that would be hard to explain to anyone who asked. I've never told Peterson what I know. I think about that sometimes. Whether I should. Whether it would matter. I think about what the entomologist wrote. Adaptive conditioning. 15 years in the dark, and they learned the sound of us. Learned to respond to it. Learned what it meant when we got close.
I need to tell you when the email arrived before I tell you anything else, because the timing matters, and I've thought about it more than I should. October 9th, 3 days before I planned to drive to Buffalo anyway. I'd already booked the hotel. I'd already pulled the diocesan records I wanted to cross-reference. St. Agnes was one of 4 properties on my research list for the trip. Abandoned Catholic school, closed 1998. A paragraph in a Buffalo News archive piece about parish consolidation. Nothing unusual. It was entry number 11 on a spreadsheet I keep for the blog, a checkbox item. I wasn't especially interested in it. The email arrived at 11:53 p.m. No subject line, no name. A Proton mail address with a randomized string of characters. The body read, "The tunnels beneath St. Agnes were never included in city blueprints. The lower level was sealed after the school closed, not before. Someone made sure of that. They never stopped using them." That was it. No signature, no additional context. I replied asking for clarification and received no response. I've checked that address dozens of times since. It has never been active again. My first reaction was mild annoyance. Anonymous tips to the blog are usually cranks or people nursing a property dispute. I filed it and went to sleep. But the phrasing stayed with me. They never stopped using them. Present tense would have felt theatrical. Past tense, the way it was written, felt like testimony, like someone stating a fact they'd waited a long time to state. I drove to Buffalo on October 11th. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 34 years old. I teach AP History and American Government at a high school outside Rochester. The blog, Closed Chapters, Architecture and History of Abandoned Religious Properties in Upstate New York, has about 4,000 regular readers, which is more than I ever expected. I started it 6 years ago because I was frustrated by how thoroughly institutional memory disappears when a building closes. The records get boxed, the boxes get lost, and eventually the story becomes local legend stripped of its specifics. I document specifics. That's what I do. That's the reason I give anyway. St. Agnes sits on a residential block in South Buffalo that peaked in 1962 and has been quietly declining since. 3 stories of pale brick, institutional windows, a flat-roofed gymnasium addition bolted to the east side sometime in the 70s, and a fenced yard where the asphalt has been slowly losing its argument with the grass for 25 years. The diocese still technically owns the property. They're not eager to sell it, and they're not eager to maintain it, which produces a particular kind of decay. Not dramatic, not collapsing, just slow and gray and still. The kind of building that doesn't draw attention because it's not interesting enough to vandalize and not dangerous enough to demolish. I'd found the former custodian through a Buffalo Historical Society contact, a man named Gerald Foss, 71 years old, who'd worked at St. Agnes from 1983 until it closed. He'd agreed to meet me outside the building and had apparently kept a key to the service entrance for 15 years without anyone asking it back. He handed it to me in the parking lot without a greeting. "You want to know about the basement?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I want to document the full building," I said carefully.
He looked at me with the face of a man who decided long ago to be finished with certain conversations. The classrooms are fine. The gymnasium is fine. The boiler room, I'll show you the boiler room. He paused. The basement level past the boiler room, that was always off limits. From when? He thought for a moment. From before I started. He unlocked the service entrance and left. He did not offer to come inside. He did not say goodbye. I watched him walk to his car and I noticed he didn't look back at the building once. The building held its age in smell rather than structure. The classrooms on the first and second floors were largely intact, desks still aligned in rows, some with textbooks still stacked on the seat shelf below the writing surface. A crucifix on each classroom wall, each one tilted slightly in the same direction, as though the building had experienced a single slow lean over the decades. Chalkboards with fragments of lessons still visible. Chapter 14, The Progressive Era, Due Friday, God Knows Your Heart. It was that last one I photographed twice. I'm not sure why. The smell was what stayed with me. Old buildings smell of dust and wood rot and slow oxidation, a passive smell, the smell of things being left alone. St. Agnes smelled of bleach underneath everything else. Not strongly, not recently, but persistently, the way a smell embeds itself in porous surfaces over years of repeated application. Whatever cleaning happened in this building was thorough and regular and continued long enough to become structural, long enough that the bleach smell was no longer a surface thing, it had become part of the walls. I documented 2 floors in about 3 hours, standard material. I was thorough but not dawdling. By 2 p.m. I was in the boiler room. The boiler itself was a 1970s-era unit, long cold, occupying the center of a low, ceilinged concrete room about the size of a 2-car garage. The usual ancillary crowded the perimeter: pipe runs, electrical panels, an ancient water softener unit. One wall had shelving with the skeletal remains of a janitorial supply operation, empty jugs, rusted can lids, a clipboard with a maintenance log. I checked the last entry out of habit. March 14th, 1998, 8 months before the school officially closed. There were 4 doors accessible from the corridor outside the boiler room, all padlocked. Not old padlocks, relatively recent hardware, the kind you'd buy at any hardware store in the last 10 years. Locked from the outside. I photographed them and noted the discrepancy in my log, then went back into the boiler room. I don't know exactly what made me look behind the furnace. The space there wasn't navigable, maybe 14 inches between the furnace housing and the rear concrete wall. I'd photographed the furnace from the front and was moving on when I noticed the floor behind it didn't match. The boiler room floor was poured concrete, cracked and stained but continuous. The paneled section behind the furnace was paneled, a rectangle approximately 4 feet by 3, set separate from the surrounding floor, the seam filled with a grout compound that had dried to a slightly different color. I moved along the side of the furnace carefully. The panel had no hardware, no handle. I found the edge with my fingers and pulled upward. It was a hinged concrete panel, counterweighted. It swung open smoothly and locked open on a pneumatic arm. Maintained, recently enough that the arm didn't stick. Below it, a narrow brick corridor, perhaps 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, dropping about 8 feet on a timber-reinforced staircase before extending horizontally into darkness. I stood there for a moment. Then I turned on my headlamp and went down. The brick corridor ran approximately 30 feet before the character of the construction changed. The brick gave way to compacted earth walls reinforced with timber framing, 4x4 posts and horizontal rails, the technique used in hand-dug excavations. The tunnel wasn't old, the timber wasn't rotted. The framing was pragmatic, modern, the work of someone who knew what they were doing but wasn't working from engineered plans. Electrical wiring ran along the ceiling. Romex cable stapled to the timber framing at regular intervals, running back towards the building's electrical system. The cable jacket was not brittle. It was not discolored by age. It was the pale yellow-white of insulation that has spent years underground, but has not spent decades. Someone had wired these tunnels after the school closed. I followed the wiring. The tunnel branched, left and right. The wire run continued left, and I followed it. After approximately 40 feet, the tunnel opened into a low, roughly rectangular chamber, maybe 15 by 20, the ceiling about 7 feet at the center, timber-framed throughout. I stood in the entrance and held the headlamp steady. Folding chairs, 8 of them arranged in a circle in the center of the chamber. The metal kind with padded seats, the type you'd see in a church fellowship hall. They weren't dusty in the way abandoned furniture gets dusty. They were dirty, underground dirty, damp and mildewed, but not layered with sediment of complete disuse. They had been used and then left, and there's a difference. I've been in enough abandoned spaces to know the difference. A tape recorder sat on the floor beside one chair, handheld, cassette format, the kind discontinued sometime in the early 2000s. I did not touch it. On a timber shelf along the left wall, a ledger, hardcover, the black and white marbled pattern of old composition books. I opened it with the hand I wasn't using for the camera. The first page had a heading, Restoration Ministry, Student Intake Records. Below that, columns, name, age, date of intake, date of release, and a notes column that used abbreviations I couldn't immediately parse, PR, SC, FI, ND, repeated in various combinations across dozens of entries. The names were students. Ages ranged from 13 to 17. The intake dates began in 1999 and ran with gaps through 2004. The school had closed in 1998. I stood in that chamber for a long time, turning pages slowly, reading names. I was methodical. I photographed every page. I was doing what I do, which meant I was not quite fully processing what I was looking at. There's a certain professional distance you maintain when documenting, a useful detachment that keeps you moving through a space without getting stopped by any single detail. The detachment lasted until 3:15 p.m.
A school bell rang, one clean tone, institutional, the unmistakable sound of a mechanical bell driven by a clapper, not the electronic pulse of a modern system. It came from somewhere deeper in the tunnel, from the right branch I hadn't taken. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds and then stopped. I turned off my headlamp. I stood in the dark for approximately 4 minutes without moving. No other sound, no footsteps, no mechanical follow-through. Just the single bell, and then silence, and the sound of my own breathing, and distantly, the settling of timber under earth pressure. I turned the headlamp back on. I finished photographing the chamber, every surface, the chairs, the shelf, the recorder, the ledger in position before I'd moved it. Then I went back the way I'd come, up the stairs, through the brick corridor, out through the panel in the boiler room floor. I did not go down the right branch. I've asked myself about that decision a number of times since. At the time, it felt like professionalism. I had what I came for, and pushing further into an unsecured underground space without knowing the layout wasn't prudent. I still think that reasoning was correct. But I also know that I was already moving before I'd consciously decided to leave. And I know that I went quickly, more quickly than I'd gone down, and that I didn't stop to review my photographs until I was out of the building and in my car in the parking lot with the doors locked. I drove to my hotel and sat at the desk for 2 hours before I opened my laptop. What I found over the following 3 weeks came from 4 sources: diocesan archives accessed through an archivist contact at a Buffalo parish, public records requests to the City of Buffalo Building Department, Buffalo News archives from 1997 through 2006, and 2 former St. Agnes faculty members who agreed to speak on background. The formal history of St. Agnes ends cleanly in December 1998. Enrollment decline, financial shortfall. Diocese consolidates parish school functions northward. Standard institutional closure. What isn't in that history, a program referred to in internal diocesan correspondence as the St. Agnes Pastoral Restoration Initiative, operated under the authority of a former vice principal who had not been formally terminated of closure but had been reclassified as an independent ministry contractor.
He ran the program with 2 former faculty members who carried similarly ambiguous post-closure employment status. Parents were told their children were being enrolled in a residential spiritual formation retreat for students with behavioral difficulties. Referrals came through informal parish networks. There were no state licenses, there were no inspections, there was no official address because the facility had no official existence. The program operated from 1999 through approximately 2004. It ended, based on what I can reconstruct from oblique references in diocesan correspondence, after an incident involving a student who required emergency medical attention and did not recover. The official record of that incident, police report, medical examiner record, any record, does not exist in any database I was able to access. One of my background sources described it as having been handled privately. The other said, with careful language, that certain families had been encouraged toward acceptance. The vice principal died in 2011. One former faculty member I was unable to locate. The other declined to speak with me and has not responded to any subsequent contact. The electrical wiring, the folding chairs in a circle, the tape recorder, the ledger running through 2004, the school bell at 3:15. I've been over my audio recordings from the tunnel chamber dozens of times. I didn't play the tape recorder, I documented it and left it, but my own recorder was running throughout my time in the chamber, capturing ambient sound, mostly silence and the shuffle of my movement and my breathing. In the last 90 seconds before I left, during the period after the bell when I was completing my documentation, there is something in the audio I initially logged as interference, a low layered sound, almost below the register of clear hearing. When I isolated the frequency and brought it up in editing software, it resolved into something that sounds like voices. Multiple voices, close together, the way a group sounds when speaking quietly in unison. The words aren't fully distinguishable, but the cadence is clear enough. And at least twice in that layered sound, I hear what sounds like my name. I've sent the file to 3 people with audio backgrounds. 2 of them hear it, 1 doesn't. None of them can explain it to my satisfaction. I went back to the ledger photographs. I've examined every page multiple times. I told myself I was looking for patterns in the abbreviations, cross-referencing names against public records. On the 43rd page, near the bottom, below an entry dated September 1998, Harper Daniel, scheduled intake, October 12, 1998. My name, spelled correctly, with a date in October of 1998, when I was 10 and living in Rochester. I have to tell you what I know and what I can't verify. I know that in 1997, I went through what my parents described, in the way parents describe things to children, as a hard year. I was impulsive. I was struggling in school. I have a memory, dim and context-less, of overhearing a conversation between my parents about a program, a word I can only reconstruct now as possibly retreat, that was discussed and then not discussed again. My uncle on my father's side attended St. Agnes in the mid-90s. He was transferred abruptly in 1997 after what my father once referred to, when he thought I wasn't listening, as the situation with Father M. The intake never happened. I was not in that program. Whatever was scheduled for October 12, 1998 did not occur, or at least I have no memory that it did, and I've been very deliberate about sitting with that sentence and examining what it means and what it doesn't mean. What I can't explain is why my name was in that ledger. What I can't explain is how whoever compiled that ledger knew to put it there. What I can't explain is the school bell at 3:15, ringing once in a sealed tunnel beneath a building that has no functioning electrical system for over 20 years. What I can't stop returning to and have no explanation for is the simplest detail of all. The email arrived 3 days before I was already going. Someone knew my travel schedule, knew where I'd be and when, knew enough to direct me specifically to the tunnels rather than the building above them. I don't know if that person wanted me to expose this. I don't know if they wanted me to understand something specific about myself. I don't know if they knew about the ledger entry. and I can't decide which possibility disturbs me more, that they did or that they didn't. I've drafted this post 4 times. I keep stopping at the same place, not at the ledger, not at the audio, but at a simpler thing. The padlocks on the basement doors, locked from the outside, new hardware on a building that officially hasn't been maintained since 1998. Someone is maintaining those locks. Someone has a key. And someone sent me an email on October 9th that brought me to that building 3 days before I would have gone anyway, directing me specifically to the tunnels, knowing what I would find. I've reported the ledger and the tunnels to the Buffalo Police Department's cold case unit,